Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I direct events here at the Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors, like tonight's featured guest, Senator Mazie Hirono and Jin Lee, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of all of you. So tonight we are thrilled and honored to have with us Senator Mazie Hirono for the launch of her memoir, Heart of Fire, An Immigrant's Daughter's Story. Senator Mazie Hirono is a graduate of the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and the Georgetown University Law Center. She has served in the Hawaii House of Representatives, 1981 through 1994, as Hawaii's Lieutenant Governor, 1994 through 2002, and in the U.S. House of Representatives, 2006 through 2013. She became Hawaii's first female senator in 2013, winning re-election in 2018. Hirono serves on the Committee on the Judiciary, the Committee on Armed Services, and the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, among others. Joining the senator in conversation is Jin Lee. Jin Lee is a recipient of fellowships in fiction from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. Her novel Pachinko was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction, a runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, winner of the Medici Book Club Prize, and the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2017. A New York Times bestseller, Pachinko was also a top 10 books of the year for the BBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and the New York Public Library. In 2019, Free Food for Millionaires was a finalist for One Book, One New York, a citywide reading program. In 2019, Lee was inducted into the New York Foundation for the Arts Hall of Fame. She received an honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters from Monmouth College. She serves as a trustee of PEN America, a director of the Authors Guild, and on the National Advisory Board of the Immigration Initiative at Harvard. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Mazie Hirono and Jin Lee to the stage.
Thank you, Sabir. Oh my gosh, what an incredible honor to be here with Mazie Hirono, the senator, the queen, the legend. I'm really excited. There are only a few of these I can do in a year. However, I really wanted to do this one because I read her memoir and it was incredibly moving. And I think that Senator Hirono has been a force of nature in Hawaii, but I think that in terms of a national prominence, we really understand her to be such an important feminist and also as a progressive and somebody who really fights for democracy in the past 5 years. We've seen her on the national stage when she fought so hard against the skinny repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And she gave a moving testimony about how she suffered with kidney cancer and how she was so grateful to have health insurance and how she wanted that to be available for all Americans. And then most recently, when during the Kavanaugh hearing, she completely took over and told the men to be better. And then, and I remember everybody just cheering, saying, "Oh, thank God for Mazie Hirono." I want everyone to read this book. I want everyone to read this memoir because one, it's beautifully written. And then also it's really a moving testimony of a young girl, an immigrant girl who becomes an American, and then she creates change. And what's so remarkable is the fact that she grew up with a single mother who raised 3 children by herself, well, with the support of her parents. And then, of course, she had several jobs, and she identifies having been a working class person, a middle class person, and now she's changing laws and trying to save America. So we have to do everything we can to understand Senator Hirono's journey. So, hi, Mazie.
Hi, Min. I've been called a lot of things, but queen sounds pretty good.
Yeah. And also, it's kind of accurate for Hawaii, right? Because in Hawaii, they did have kings and queens.
Oh, yes. We had a monarchy. Yes.
Right.
The last ruler was a queen.
Right. There you go. So I think Queen Mazie should be a new thing. I was wondering, so that we can have everyone sort of hear your words, if you would read to us a teeny tiny bit. And so folks, it's about a page and a quarter, not even really a page. And it's the very beginning, and it's a really nice setup. And I'm going to set it up for Mazie, because it's about her experience as a very young girl when she first arrives in America, actually about 2 years after she arrives. And it's, would you like to talk a little bit about your grandparents and about your mom in this moment?
I was living with my grandparents, my mother's parents, from the age of 3 till just before we came to Hawaii. So I lived with my grandparents for about 5 years. And during that time, I really had a very happy childhood with my grandparents. I was like my grandmother's shadow, my Bachan and Ji-chan. And so I had a really happy childhood. Things were not quite like that at my father's home where my mother was. So I can start reading from the part where I say, unfortunately, things were not nearly so congenial at my father's house.
I love this section.
So unfortunately, things were not nearly so congenial at my father's house. One afternoon, about 2 years after Yuriko had died, as an aside, Yuriko was my younger sister, when Shigeki was still an infant, my father stumbled home from a week-long drinking and gambling bender. Chieko, my mother, begged him to give up mahjong and liquor for the sake of their children. But Matabe, my father, laughed with no hint of mercy and shook his head no. Chieko asked him again the next morning, in the brief moment after he slipped off the stupor of drink and before he disappeared again. This time he told her clearly and without equivocation that what she was asking would never happen. That was when she knew that her husband would never change. I threatened to leave him then, my mother recalled. I even told my mother-in-law that I wanted a divorce. She replied that I was free to leave her son, but I would not be allowed to take her grandchildren. I never mentioned it again. I was 9 years old when my mother told me this. I marveled at the lack of bitterness in her tone, though her eyes searched the high corner of our rented room on Kibala Street in Honolulu, as if she were seeing again the hopeless young wife she had been. Chieko felt she had no choice but to endure the lot she had cast for herself, in foolish defiance of her mother. Her unhappiness was relieved only by her visits to my grandparents and me. But when Yoshikazu turned 6 and was ready to enter first grade, an important milestone in the life of a Japanese child, there was a breaking point. My uncle Akira had given my mother money to buy his nephew first grade uniform and a new pair of shoes. Akira, who had returned to Hawaii as a young man, had served for 3 years in the United States military during the Korean War, but had some sense of the condition of his sister's marriage from her letters. On a visit to my grandparents' farm in Fukushima a few months earlier, Akira had urged Chieko to bring the children and join him on Oahu. Though grateful for her brother's offer, Mom wasn't yet ready to make the fateful step that would mark the end of her marriage. Her husband happened to be at home when she got back to Tadami. She was careful not to let him see her tuck the money Akira had given her underneath the futon. She thought she would bide her time until he left again before purchasing Yoshikazu's first grade uniform and school supplies. She didn't have to wait long. Matabe was gone by the time she opened her eyes the following morning. But when she went to get the money, it was gone. Matabe arrived home several days later, sporting a new spring overcoat. Chieko understood immediately where the money for their son's school uniform had gone. Matabe had taken it just as he had taken the condolence money for Yuriko's death. Chieko swallowed her anger with such force that she thought she would choke. But she was no longer hopeless. That was the evening she began to plot her escape.
I just found that section to be so chilling in so many ways because, first of all, as a dramatist, you've made a decision as a narrator of your story to name everybody in your family with their first names.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That was an authorial decision that you made, and also I think it shows a kind of distancing as the person who remembers is an adult now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So every single person can be seen in their humanity. So you have grandparents that are, the mother, the maternal grandparents, you have the mother and the father, and you also have you at that moment in time as almost, you're like an infant. I mean, you're so tiny at that moment, right? So you could barely remember. And then you have this young woman who has married the wrong person against the wishes of her parents. So she really believes that she has to suffer the consequences for a very long time.
Yes.
And I was just curious of what you thought about why women believe that when they make the wrong decision when they're young, that it has to be something they have to suffer through.
In the Japanese culture, there is a word called gaman,
right?
Where you just persevere, you just endure. And she had children. And so there she is on a farm in rural Japan, not much support for her at all. Her parents are in the same prefecture, but much farther away. And so there she is, a young wife. There didn't seem to be a lot that she could do. But my mother showed her determination even then. She was not even 30 years old when she finally decided that she had to put a lot of distance between my father, his family, and us.
Yeah, I really found that to be really so moving. And also what I love about it is that at the beginning of the book, it's such a smart way to think about she began to plot.
You had to plot.
Right. Because it wasn't like she could just like walk out and leave. She had to figure out, where am I going to get the money? How am I going to get from point A to point B? How am I going to take all these children? Because it's not like she can just walk out. She has all these young lives that she's responsible for. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is in pages 40 to 41. And this is really important. I'm just going to read this little tiny section because it's about the title of the book. It's about Keiko, or Laura, because that's her American name, and your mom. And you said she had a heart of fire.
Yes.
And she would always pick herself up and try something else, seek another way forward. Mom didn't believe in feeling sorry for herself or in bemoaning her circumstances. She intended to take care of us, and in that purpose, she never wavered. Always looking out for the next opportunity, she would prepare herself to meet whatever challenges it might hold. I mean, that's really the title of the book. It's about your mother, but it's really also about you.
I think it has some of those embers and the fire, slow burning, and sometimes it just kind of erupts, So,
I love it when it erupts.
From her.
We're like, more fire, Mazie, more fire.
Yes.
So
sometimes I have to tell myself to calm down these days.
Well, it's kind of funny about the heart of fire because it's such an interesting metaphor. Like, where do you think that you got this from? And what do you want it to mean? Like in terms of fire, it's not like the heart of ice. It's a heart of fire.
Oh, it burns bright. It's there's heat.
Yeah.
It speaks to me of determination, perseverance, but it's also fire. It's also embers that burn slowly that can be passed on, but it's there. It's burning, and it can flare up. And it flared up for my mother when she determined that she was going to leave. And I asked her, my mother had a pretty middle-class life in Hawaii. She was born in Hawaii. That's what makes my story so unique, that I have a mother who was born in Hawaii, and all her children are born in Japan, so they belong to the father. We're all Japanese nationals. And so, she had a pretty middle-class life, I thought. And I asked her, Mom, where did you find the courage? Did you know you had it in you? And she said she didn't know, but she just knew she had to do it. And she had to do it while she was not even 30. She decided she had to do it then.
I also thought what was really interesting is that she was obviously somebody who was deeply loved. And because she was so loved, I think she was capable of loving her children. I mean, even to the extent that she forsook a culturally mandated identity and was willing to love her children more to save them, because she's really about, what I thought that the story of the uniform was so important is because she wasn't mad that somebody stole money up from her. She was really angry that somebody stole money from her children.
That was the last straw because in Japan, a boy's first grade is really important. They wear those nice uniforms, and it's like a rite of passage going to school. And to think that he just took it and bought something for himself was the last straw for my mother.
But I just found that to be so smart and moving. There's another section that I wanted to talk a little bit about I think Old Man Okabe. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit of Old Man Okabe? Because he's an important person to me, because I want to talk about the internecine classism of our communities. About within our own communities, we have to suffer this kind of bizarre class hierarchy and how much it makes us suffer in a unique way. And I was wondering if you could talk about Old Man Okabe.
Mr. Okabe knew my grandparents when they were all in the plantation. And my grandparents, because my grandmother was an entrepreneur, she created a business. She had a bathhouse. They saved enough money to go back to Japan. The Okabes did not. They had to stay here on Hawaii, where they did very well. So when my grandparents had to return, they had to sponsor them. My mother was not in any financial position to sponsor her parents. So the Okabes did. And so they pretty much were very beholden to the Okabes. And that's when we moved from our little one-room place. You can't even call it an apartment. It was one-room boarding house to the Okabes' property in a shack there. And my grandmother worked for him for free. I guess that was rent. And he was quite the curmudgeon.
Well, he seemed like such a jerk, because there's a couple of points when I know, I could say it, but you can't. So basically, he had these sort of terms, almost like indentured servants, and your grandparents were treated like sharecroppers, weren't they?
Yes.
Because we had that whole plantation system in Hawaii, and this is a flower farm. Is that right?
It was a flower farm. That's when this area called Hawaii Kai now, it's all developed, but it used to be called Kokohead, all flower farms and pig farms. So it was country.
Right.
For Oahu, it was way country. And so there we lived in an unpainted shack. And that's what I call my grapes of wrath period.
Yeah.
There's no sidewalks. It's really dusty. It's red dirt. And my grandparents, my grandmother is working on this farm. And so he pretty much lorded it over us. And he also was a really terrific, he did the sumie, the Japanese calligraphy, and he had a little room or shack next to ours, and he needed peace and quiet. And if we were watching TV or talking to it loudly, he would say, "Be quiet, yakamashi."
Oh, yakamashi. Ooh. So there's and I point to Old Man Okabe for a couple of reasons, but one of the things that were important is that there's an important thing that your mother does, and also there's a very important realization that you have about your brother Wayne. So your mother saves up to get the red tricycle for Wayne, and she does it because Wayne was left behind in Japan. He eventually gets reunited with your family, and it's a very beautiful thing that she does. And she can't carry this red tricycle back home, so she gets Okabe's, I think, son to drive her, right?
Yes.
And then you can just tell that little tiny story, because it's very, very beautiful.
My younger brother was left behind when my mother brought me and my older brother to Hawaii, because we were old enough to start school and my younger brother was not, and there would be nobody to take care of him in Hawaii. So he was left with the same loving grandparents who raised me for so much of my time in Japan. We did not know the trauma that this separation would cause my brother, but he had trouble in school from kindergarten on. Now he would be deemed a learning disabled child and would probably get extra help, but back then, no. And so my mother always felt such a sense of caring for him, that he was a very sensitive boy. And we didn't have a car or anything. We took the bus everywhere. And so she bought him a tricycle, and the Okabe's son delivered it. And he was so happy. He rode that tricycle everywhere along those dirt roads. And I have a picture of him that's in my mind's eye, that he's got a bandana on and he's got this big smile and he's riding this tricycle. And then after a time, he stopped riding it so much. And it wasn't until years later, like 20 years later or something, and somehow the subject came up, And Wayne, by that time he was called Wayne. And the subject of the tricycle came up, and Wayne said, "Oh, that tricycle, the Okabes bought it for me." And my mother just stopped, and she said, "No, I bought it for you." It's painful to think about, even now.
Well, can I just read this tiny paragraph then? Would that be okay? Because it's so
Sure.
beautiful. And I want you guys to realize how much this is not a regular political memoir in any way at all. It's a deeply personal account. And Mazie went to where artists go to tell the story that really formed who she is and how she remembered it. And this paragraph is so beautiful. And I wanted to share it with you. Even if Old Man Okabe's grandson had truly believed what he was saying, I have often wondered why he felt the need to taunt Wayne like that, effectively saying to him, "You have nothing. You are nothing." To my mind, the boy's behavior was rooted in the belief that Wayne and the rest of us were beneath him, as if our material need made us somehow inferior to his family. Certainly, it was how his grandfather seemed to feel. Sadly, the old man's patronizing attitude appeared to have infected his grandson too. Wayne was crushed, but he carried his hurt in silence. It was not until he was in his 20s that he one day mentioned it in passing the red tricycle that the Okabes had bought for him. Mom's face fell. And I love this so much because it really explains to me how you as an adult believe so much in the advocacy for the poor.
Yes, to say the least.
Right. No, but I think it's because I remember these moments in my childhood when I first came to America, when we had nothing. We were middle class, and then all of a sudden we had nothing. And then when people kept reminding you, because you have nothing, that you are nothing. And I thought in that paragraph, you distilled it so perfectly of the cruelty of others to equate the lack of materials to somehow about character. And
Yes.
I was just really so happy that you did that.
And of course, my younger brother did not have the wherewithal to fight back.
Right. And you protect us from bullies.
Yeah, there's something about bullies, and that's why when the biggest bully of them all confronted my face, I began to use my vocal cords more.
Well, and can we talk a little bit about that? And obviously, we're going to jump forward and backwards and forwards. But I think that you talk about this in your preface that in 2016, you really started to understand the other pandemic, the pandemic of hatred, right? And how you had to fight that. And I was just curious, like, do you think that the standing up to bullies, because you've had a political career for a very long time. I mean, you're politicized when you're in college, really,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
I mean, you're
Yes.
doing democratic grassroots activism really starting in college with, I think, David, is it Hagino, pardon me, Hagino's campaigns, and then all the way through. And you did every single kind of job in terms of politics. So can you talk to us about bullies and how you handle them?
Well, I think there's something about bullies that just it gets a rise out of me, and it happened in the intermediate school I was going to, and I talk about this because it's an example of how one person can stop something bad from happening. I show up at the school. It's Jared. At that time it's Jared Intermediate School. It's kind of a rough school. It was a cultural awakening for me to go from New Valley Intermediate, which is all totally middle class, to Jared. And I walked to school barefooted, and I arrived at school and I saw all these kids by the schoolyard, and I just wondered what was going on. And it was these bully boys who were tormenting a dog by trying to push him into the rubbish cans. And everybody was just standing there watching, and I just couldn't take it. So I just walked up to them. I said, "Stop doing that." And they just stopped, because I mean, I'm in seventh grade or something. I'm not exactly a big kid, so they stopped. They were surprised. And then all one of them could say was, "Why, this your dog?" I said, "No, but just stop it." And then, lo and behold, they stopped. And that's it's a lesson learned, that hard as it is when you're in a crowd and nobody's doing anything, but you can say something. And it's not as though I wasn't scared. I thought they might hit me or something, but one person can do that. And so that was a bully experience, and I just didn't like it when people would push me around. I've had other experiences where people would push me around, and I would talk back. And the thing is that there's some of us who have the capacity, the vocal, we have the vocabulary to fight back. And my younger brother never did. I empathize so much with that lack of voice that he had. But I know he felt the pain. So meanwhile, I'm standing up to bullies in different ways in my political life. Usually it's the guys, hassling me and all that. And I would ignore them. And that is why one of them said to me, you know what they call you behind your back? And I said, what? He said, they call you Ice Queen. And Ice Queen, not ice cream, Ice Queen. And I took it as a compliment, actually, because if they thought I was the Ice Queen, that meant that they would leave me alone and we could just talk about substance of things. That's how I chose to operate. And so, yes, in my culture, man, I don't know about yours, but in my culture, the Japanese culture as well as the local culture, we're not very confrontational. We're not very verbal. Being verbal, vocal, aggressive are not traits that are seen as positives, especially coming from a girl. And so I figured out how to get things done without having to be that vocal. So I viewed myself as a workhorse, not a show horse, meaning I wasn't going to be out there, rallying, ranting or anything like that. So that was it until Trump came along. And he was such a big bully that I just felt the need to speak up and call him what he was, a misogynist, a liar. At one point, I called him a grifter, and my friend John Tester, this was, I don't know, last year or something. He said, you made our papers in Montana, and he said, they said you called Trump a liar. And I said, oh, don't forget, I called him a grifter too. He said, oh yeah.
And actually, you're correct. I mean, you're correct in terms of all assessments. I was going to go right back to that Okabe thing because we finished that scene with, is it Yamakashi? That whole idea of Yamakashi, of shut up.
Yakamashi.
I'm sorry.
Yakamashi meaning shut up.
Right.
Too noisy.
But what's really amazing is the last section of the Okabe, the ending of the Okabes, is that the old man Okabe is doing his calligraphy in the next door shed. And then here we have Mazie and her family in the shed next door, actually living in the shed. It's not an artist shed. That's where they live. And they have to be quiet and stepping around all the time. And at one point, your mother, go Laura, she says, one night as mom came through the door from work, Wayne rushed over to her, chattering about some event from his day. As painfully shy and quiet as my brother was, his excitement in sharing a story was a special occurrence to be savored. Mom stooped to listen to him, her hands on his small shoulders. At that time, we heard old man Okabe muttering and grumbling about the little boy being too loud. It was, from my mother, the last straw, one she had no idea would be so soon in coming. She straightened up, stalked across the room to the window. Shut up, she shouted at the old man. Just shut up. I mean, I read that and I was like this. But then also she was modeling for you about advocacy, right?
Oh, yes. Standing up for herself.
And standing up for her child.
And taking control of our lives and her life. That's what she did. And we knew we had to move.
And you guys did move.
Yes. To an actual painted house. It was so nice. Wow, it's painted. We took notice of those small things because we really didn't have much materially, but we definitely had a ferocious mother.
Well, but isn't that amazing? Because she was born in Hawaii. She wasn't a citizen because of the bizarre rules about Hawaii until later on. So citizenship was sort of a shifting thing for anybody who was born in Hawaii, who was a national elsewhere. But then she was able to come back, bring her children who were born from Japan. But she somehow, I mean, she left she left Hawaii when she was in her teens, right? Mm-hmm. So she spoke English according to, like, yes. How well was her English? Like, how good was it?
Well, 15 years old, so
probably excellent.
Actually, mom was, I'm sure, a pretty quiet person, very
Okay.
reserved. But she knew English. She had dual citizenship. Born here, she was American, but she also was Japanese. She had a dual citizenship. That's the only thing that enabled her to bring us here. She
Right.
evoked her citizenship. And then, of course, she hadn't spoken English in a long, long time. But she spoke Japanese far, far better. And she read everything in Japanese more than she did English. But the ultimate irony was she ended up with a really good job being a proofreader for the English language, for the English paper here, for the American paper, the advertiser.
Well, that's something that I really couldn't get because she had this English language. She goes to Japan, she becomes fluent in Japanese. She comes back here again as an adult. And then she's a typesetter. And then she
Mhm.
also works in like a restaurant, right?
Catering company at night.
Right. So she's got a catering company. She's got two jobs. She's barely sleeping. She's falling, she actually even injures her pinky or something because
Yeah.
of probably her fatigue. And
Yes.
then she has later on to make more money, she takes a
Mhm.
higher level job as a
As a
proofreader.
proofreader.
But she teaches herself how to be a proofreader.
Yes, my mother is just so focused. She knew she had to go do a good job because she didn't even have a English high school education. But the person who hired her wanted to give her a chance, and she knew that that was her chance. So she applied herself. She created her own book on how to, all the proofreading, all the little nuances and everything else. She was really good. I would say she was probably she was probably the best proofreader at the newspaper.
It's so incredible.
That's my mom.
I think that's such a it's funny because I have interviewed thousands of people for the research that I do for my books from all different backgrounds, but a lot of Asians and Asian Americans, but from everywhere. And one of the things that's really remarkable is how people take difficult situations. Because we could say you had an incredible mother who taught you how to be an incredible woman, or you could say I had a disappointing father, and for the rest of my life I'm going to be upset about it. It really is about how you interpret your story. Why do you think that you interpret it in that way?
One, I recognized really early on that my mom had changed my life, and I was grateful for that. I never missed my father. I never thought about him. He was a non-presence, and I realized pretty early on that it took a great deal of courage from my mother to bring us to this country. And so I think I'm not bragging or anything, but I had a
You should
certain
brag. It's okay to brag.
I had a certain maturity at a pretty young age. And so in elementary school and throughout, I understood the struggles of my mother. And I determined that this was the time when all these people were protesting and, they were rebelling, I should say, rebelling against their parents. I never felt the need to rebel because my mother pretty much supported me in everything I did.
Well,
so that was pretty amazing. And also, she didn't have the stereotype that I would get married and have children and go off somewhere, living happily, because that never happened to her. And so she never once asked me when I was going to get married or when I would have children. She knew that I was very intent on doing something with my life that would be giving back to the state that gave me so much. I just didn't know how it would show itself. Certainly nobody in my family did politics. Even I didn't think about politics in high school. My goodness.
Can we talk a little bit about Roy, your older brother? So
Yes.
you wrote that he took I think the adjective that you used was he took a dim view. He took a dim view of politics and your political leanings. How did you feel about that? Because so you have this mom who basically says, I delight in you, do whatever you want, sweetheart. And then you also have a brother that goes, politics, it's not a real job.
Well, Roy had to mature and take responsibility at a pretty young age too, because he's the man in the family. Although my mother never laid that on him, but he realized it. So he started working at a really young age, and he kept one job for what? Till he retired. Meanwhile, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm going off to Waimanalo, and this is why he asked my mother, when is Mazie getting a real job? It just took me longer. I did not peak in high school, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So,
So when are you going to get
but my
your real
brother,
job?
totally steady, and he knows how to do things. Like my mother, he and my mother, they know how to do things. My mother put up her own tool shed. She ordered the thing from Sears Roebuck and put it up, and she knows how to wield power tools and all that. Whereas my husband and me, forget it. We don't even know how to open a camera practically. So we're pretty pathetic. And then meanwhile, so I have my mother and my brother who know how to do things, and my brother he's very much like my mother in that he just does things.
Well, I like him. I like him because I think he
Yeah.
was a good older brother. And
Yes, he is.
but I did think the attitude was really interesting about like politics.
Yeah,
And also,
I
I
know.
think he reflects a lot of what Asian Americans feel about politicians, right? There's a kind of like, is that a real thing? Like, how do you
Yeah.
do that? It's difficult. I'm so delighted that more Asian Americans are entering into politics.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing. I was curious when you talk a little bit about, there's a lot of diction here about your love life in this book. I guess, by the way, audience, I want you to know there's a lot in here about her love life. So can we talk a little bit about Allison? Allison, who is
Allison Lind. He was my boyfriend off and on, but for 18 years. Can you imagine?
yes,
So he also didn't have a father. But unlike me, I think he really, he very much was affected by the death of his father. Whereas my father's non-presence and my mother's big presence really, I think my mother loomed large for me. And so here's this guy, and we're in high school together, and there's a whole long story about how he pushed himself to become editor in chief of a school paper that I was supposed to be editor in chief of, having worked on the school
I was
paper.
kind of angry at him about that.
Oh yeah, well, sometimes there's a certain arrogance that I realized he had. That it's like he knew he had so much writing talent that if he was going to deign to go work on the school paper, although it was an award-winning paper, that he would have to be named editor-in-chief. And the thing was that there already was one, and that would be me. So the big announcement was that, you're going to have a co-editor-in-chief. And I tell you, at that time, that very little, I accepted it, but I did most of the work, which is something that a lot of women can relate to, that they come in with their arrogance and we do the work. But at one point I did tell him, just get over here because you got to do the work. But anyway, long story short, he got a scholarship to go to Colgate. There were very few students in my high school who actually got accepted to go to mainland schools. So we had a graduating class of 750, and I can count on my two hands the people who went off to school, because that just didn't happen. But he was one of them. We did this whole layout of all of the students going off to school, and off he went to Colgate. And next thing I knew, I see him walking to school, and we started to talk. I was never close to him in high school because he was very standoffish. I think he probably thought I was a drone or something. I don't know.
Well, maybe
Anyhow,
you're his competitor. You're his competitor.
Well, now I think of it maybe that way, but back then I just thought that he was this, guy who obviously thought he was much smarter than me. So
and he also had a crush on you, because that was really clear. But can we just go?
Think?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you did date him for 18 years, and he did ask you to marry him. So
it makes me wonder about myself, but he was very competitive with me, and that's one of the things that I learned about a relationship. One should not have a relationship where you compete with each other. I think it's very disastrous to the relationship. But he felt the need to compete with me, and always with him on the I had to be the intellectual superior and everything else. So 18 years, and finally, and by the time in between, I had this relationship with my current husband. So that's a whole other thing going on there. So there was like a
and
year.
It's in the book, everybody. It's in the book.
Yes, it is in the book. And so anyway, that I'm seeing Leighton, he's in between this whole 18 years old relationship. And finally, Allison asked me to marry him. I said, I have to think about it. I know he was astounded, because I'm thinking 18 years. It took him 18 years to figure out that maybe he's going to, ask me to marry him. And I said, I have to think about it. And I didn't get back to him until he called me. He said, it's been 2 weeks. So what is it? I said, no. And that's when I realized, and just thinking back to our relationship, that I basically saved myself by not marrying him.
You know, I wanted to dwell on the Allison section of the book, you know, and then we could, I'm not going to talk about the Leighton part because that's a happy story. I'm only mentioning it because in that story of the 18 years, and this is so important for the young feminists out there, is that our love choices really affect our professional choices. I mean, that's borne out in your mother's story. It's borne out in your story. And I was curious about, you talk specifically about a text that was very seminal to you, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan,
Yes.
a book I love too. I love this book. So can you talk a little bit about why that was important to you?
I'm in college, and I honestly thought, even if I was raised in a pretty non-traditional way with a very courageous mother, but I still had incorporated the expectations of what I call a dominant culture, and the expectations for girls like me. We would, if we went to college, we would get married, have children, and I really thought that. So I think I was a sophomore in college when I read The Feminine Mystique, and I can say that a light bulb went on in my head, and I thought, why am I even thinking that some guy is going to come and take care of me and I will have a, happy middle class life? I said, where does that kind of thinking even come from? And so that's when I began to, I really stopped thinking that I'm going to get my degree and I'm going to get married. No, I literally stopped thinking like that. And it wasn't as though it was a straight shot as to what else I was going to do with my life, but I let go of this idea of getting married and having children. And so by the time I turned to politics, I ran my first campaign in 1970. I was still in college, I think, senior. I really didn't think about getting married or having children until a long ways out. Those were not my priorities. And not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just not the path that I decided I would be on.
Well, I love that so much because I think young feminists really need to hear that today, that they actually have those options and that all these received messages are just received messages. They're not necessarily truths. And I think that your life really bears that out. I don't think we have that much time, but there's this one section which is really, and now I'm really jumping forward because I think if we know more about your recent history, I love what you told, well, the current Vice President Harris, but what you told her toward the end of the book, and this is not giving anything away, you said, this is two sentences. As I said to Kamala Harris after the Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, chose her to be his running mate in what was widely characterized as a battle for the soul of America, quote, this is what Mazie said, everybody. She said, we're in a knife fight, so don't bring a teaspoon. We are in a knife fight, so don't bring a teaspoon. Boy, can you talk a little bit about that?
I texted that to Kamala, and she sat near me in the Judiciary Committee, and the three of us, it would be me, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris, and she coined the term, we are the POSs of that committee, the people of color. And we all sat together because we were the least senior people. I remember somebody saying, do they make them all sit together like that on this big committee because they're all people of color? No, because we would have, I was very simpatico with Kamala, and I was delighted when she was chosen. But I knew we were going to be in a fight, and I thought, boy, let's get real here. We've been watching Mitch McConnell run the Senate, where hardly anything, I can't think of a single really good thing that he did. And so we have to be very clear-eyed about how ruthless Mitch McConnell is and how ruthless the Republicans were. And therefore, we have to be very clear-eyed. So don't bring us a teaspoon. And so there were other exchanges that we had. There was one time that it's very funny. She was on the campaign trail and she was still running for president. And I remember going out of the voting, and there's an area where people pick us up. And she was getting into her car, and I was getting picked up for my thing. And I saw her, and I said, Kamala, are you going to Iowa now? And she said, I'm effing moving to Iowa. I don't know if I can swear, but one of the things I really like about Kamala is, like me, she does swear. Oh. So, and then she had all these T-shirts that were made, and she took it on. She made money off of it. You know, so we got a big laugh out of that, and so I'm very fond of Kamala. I
Oh,
miss her in that committee, Judiciary Committee.
wow. Well, that's incredible. And I just love this story so much. And Sabir is here with questions from the audience for Mazie.
Well, I'm so sorry to interrupt that.
No, no.
Fantastic. We do have a few audience questions. And I think a good one to pivot off of your last answer, Senator Hirono, is from Anonymous, who says, given how the country is now so divided, how do you envision the present Biden administration and yourself reaching across the aisle to make policies bipartisan? Or do you envision the Democratic Party going at it alone?
We're going to try and work in a bipartisan way, but we didn't spend the last 4 years watching Mitch McConnell do very little to help people, except the 1.5 trillion tax cuts for the richest 1% of people and corporations, and pack our courts with over 200 right-wing, ideologically driven judges for lifetime appointments. I didn't watch that for 4 years and think that he was going to extend his hand to say, oh, now we're going to work with the Democrats. Notice that the rescue package did not get a single Republican. I said that I guess they decided that none of their constituents deserved $1,400 in their pockets and workers, unemployment compensation, and all that. And so I did work across the aisle on the first bill that basically we passed in the Senate. The first standalone bill of its kind was my COVID-19 hate crimes bill. And not because the Republicans, some of them didn't try to derail the bill, but I worked with Susan Collins to expand support for the bill while retaining the purpose. So I am more than happy. We're more than happy as long as they are operating in good faith to come to a meeting of the minds, and they're just not out to do as little as possible for the people when the need is great. So we'll work with them as much as we can. I will continue to work on issues that we have mutual interest in with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But on big things, I think that we will work with them. But if they're just stalling and all that, we're going to need to use some other process to get things done for people.
Thank you for that. And then our next question is from Keiko, who says, how has your relationship and sentiment for Japan changed over the years, if it has?
I realized that I never would have had the opportunities for education. Certainly, I wouldn't be running for office if my mother had not changed my life. She totally changed my life by bringing me here. But I love Japan. I'm just happy that I'm here. But I love Japan. I love their aesthetics. I love I watch NHK on the weekends, so I can, I have a deep appreciation for the aesthetics and culture of the country.
Oh. And then our next question, which is actually the most popular based on the audience votes, is there are so many intersections of identity in your life story. Immigrant, woman of color, growing up lower class. How did that impact how you approached the memoir? Did you have to prioritize any identities? And that's from Tomiko.
I basically wanted to tell my mother's story and the courage that she had. And so, well, it's pretty chronological, but it is very much connected to the things that I fought for all my political life. And so I never forget where I came from and who I fight for and why.
That's right. And then our next question is from Valerie, who says, did your family have any misgivings about you sharing their stories in your memoir? Did they get a final edit?
I have a very small family. It consists of my mother, who had 2 strokes, which is one of the reasons I wrote this when I did. She was not able to really talk or anything, so I wanted to tell her story. And then I have my husband, who I refused to let him get involved in the process because it was hard enough for me to be true. And if he had his own notions, I would have to fend with that. So I said, he's not going to be involved. And then I have my older brother, so that was kind of it. You know, there's a lot to be said for being an immigrant and not having any relatives, basically. Get to write your story, and as a memoir, it's my recollection. So there.
And our next question is from Anonymous, who asks, what is one thing most people don't know about you that you would like it if they did?
I really love art, and I actually have a sense of humor, but I don't tell jokes. I find a lot of things funny.
A sense of humor is a great thing. Our next question is from Dory, who says, thank you for your wonderfully written, touching memoir. I read it in 2 days. It makes me proud to be a local Asian woman from Hawaii and to have you fighting for us these many years. As someone who also loves to read, what have you read lately that you would recommend? Mahalo, Dory.
Well, I'm not just sucking up to men, but one of my most recent books is Pachinko, which I am telling everybody to read. I read a lot of books. I read more than one book at one time.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer. I'm also reading Viet Nguyen's books. You know, I hadn't read The Sympathizer, so I'm reading that. And then I read mysteries. I read a lot of mysteries while I'm at it.
Oh, that's a delightful cross section. All of the books you've named are fantastic. That'll be an enjoyable reading time. And then our next question is from Juliana, who asks, have you kept in contact with any of your young friends who you mentioned in the book, like Stephanie, Judy, or Sandy?
Well, Judy passed away.
Oh.
Stephanie, no, because she, coming from the family she did, she went off to private school after 6th grade. And I'll tell you, I ran into her not too long ago, and she said, you really sound different now. And I said, you mean more articulate? And she said, no, more howly. I just thought that was so hilarious. You know what howly is? Howly means like
white,
Caucasian.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel insulted by it. I just started to laugh.
Sometimes you have to laugh.
You do.
And Sandy, every once in a while I talk with her, but we moved every 2 years. And so having long friendships. Also, I'm very self-contained. I've discovered that I tend to like to be alone a lot. Although I certainly picked a very strange profession in which to do that.
Yes.
So I enjoy being with people, but when I go home, that's it. Nobody better call me up unless something really terrible is happening.
Are you an introvert? Like, did you ever do the Myers-Briggs? Like, are you an
yes.
You are an introvert, right?
Yes. And
yeah, I could tell. Yeah. Which makes politics really hard.
Well, I think we should reflect on why we do things. And, you know, I think it's important to understand what our own motives are that makes us do things. I don't think, to tell the truth, I don't think that many Republicans are introspective, because if they were, they would really have to question themselves, I'd say.
Oh.
I don't know how they sleep at night. I really don't.
Yes, I've said that too.
Yes, I've heard you say it, and I agree. I've heard Nancy Pelosi say it too. It's like, I don't know how they sleep at night.
So they know how to bifurcate. And when you bifurcate, that means that you're not a whole person. That's how I look at it. You're not being true to yourself.
I wish there were more introverts in public service.
Yes.
I do.
Yes. I found some. They're in my reflections group.
Oh, good. What's a reflections group?
Oh, I read about it a little bit. There's a group of, it's sort of self-selected. And in my case, it's senators who are very reflective, and people like Sherrod Brown, Tammy Baldwin, others. They're a very, very important part of keeping me on an even keel in the Senate.
Oh, I think for our final question of the evening, which is from Tishara and bounces off of that, your last answer rather nicely. She asks, why public service?
Because it really is a way for me to give back. I just didn't know that I would turn to running for office, because that is definitely not everybody's cup of tea. But in protesting the Vietnam War, that was my political awakening, and I ran my first political campaign 1970, and I ran for office myself 1980. Very typical. It takes a woman a much longer time to feel prepared and experienced enough, but I've turned to politics, and I just didn't think I'd be able to do it for as long as I have. And sometimes I think to myself, how the heck, but I'm grateful, because I am an advocate, and being in the legislative arena, I get to be an advocate. I fight for the people and the causes that I believe in. And I'm a lot more vocal about it, because I am in an arena where being vocal is in many ways rewarded, unlike in my culture here, how I was brought up. So one thing I learned, though, in politics is, because I'm very reserved and self-contained, I realized that in politics I had to really get out of my comfort zone, and we all have the capacity to get out of our comfort zone, to talk to total strangers, to be able to contend with things, and we all have that capacity, and that's why my 3 life lessons: one person can make a difference. Mom changed my life by bringing me to this country. Half the battle is showing up, not just physically but emotionally, staying the course, being very determined to, the battles we thought we'd won for equal rights, voting rights, a woman's right to choose, all these battles don't stay won. So eternal vigilance. And the third is to take risks. Get out of your comfort zone. Those are my 3 life lessons.
I think that's a wrap. So hang on. 1 person can make a difference. 2 is half the battle is showing up.
Yep.
And the 3rd is take risks.
Yes.
There you go. You heard it here. Senator Mazie Hirono, the greatest. Please read this book.
Thank you. There you go.
Thank you so much, Mazie.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you both so much. And to all the people who are participating, mahalo nui loa, everyone. Stay safe. Be kind.
Thank you both so much. It's been an honor. And to our audience, have a wonderful night. If you haven't purchased a book yet, you can click on the green button center of your screen. And with that note, good night.
Good night.